finding aids, so it's impossible to use, on top of which it contains a huge amount of rubbish. Things which aren't genuine Cromwell things at all. It contains a great deal of stuff that he signed but never had anything to do with. I mean, they crossed his desk when he's head of state and just signs them. Huge numbers of warrants and things which are pro formas. They're really printed pro formas and your signs, but they're all there, undifferentiated. He offers a worse modernized transcription than the Victorian one. And when he has the problem of speeches, which David will talk about, for example, he produces a hybrid. He simply chooses bits from different versions without explaining what he's doing. It is a truly awful edition. And yet people have been using it. On top of which he writes, I think he hits 3,600 pages, of which about 2,000 pages are his own. And he fell out of love with Cromwell. He became convinced that Cromwell was a prototype Hitler or a prototype Stalin. So he becomes more and more furious with, and more sort of angry with Cromwell as he goes on. So the whole thing is hopeless. That's why we need a new edition, for the a proper edition. So what we went out, I was asked by AUP to do it. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be a sort of do a heroic solo thing. So I gathered a group of friends and relations around me, and we set off about 12 years ago. And of course, why we were able to do it so well, apart from the fact that we've got an excellent team, is of course the digital revolution. All the world's great libraries and museums have now digitized their catalogues. So we're able to find a huge number of things which nobody had seen for hundreds of years. Some things we just by serendipity. I went with one of my colleagues to Northamptonshire Record Office in order to look at some papers, and they'd forgotten we were coming, so they had to send out, because nowadays lots of these things are kept off site. We had to wait for them to bring them in. And we were looking at their little library, which was pretty hopeless. My colleague was thumbing through a Country Life, and she said, "We don't have the original of that letter Cromwell wrote after Marston Moor, do we?" No, I said, so apparently it's at Chequers because of the photograph of it in Country Life. So there were all kinds of getting into Chequers was a pretty amazing thing, and it did involve me being held up at gunpoint because we went in by the wrong entrance. We went in by the Prime Minister's entrance and not by the tradesman's entrance. So it was exciting. I mean, you think editing must be a very boring job, but it has its excitements. We were able to digitize everything, so we got 25,000 photographs of all the various versions of all the various items, and this meant we were able to do much more, really good comparisons. And we were using some technology which is called a virtual research environment, based on a commercial adapted for us by Trinity College Dublin, where I'm an honorary fellow, which I'm going to say no more at this stage. I'll talk about it later if you're remotely interested. It's a combination, an Amazon warehouse, storage where you can find things very easily, and a social networking site. And working as a team, we were then able to produce what we think is a highly consistent edition, which uses the original text, reproduces the original text as closely as you can, and does all kinds of other things we will talk about in the next 30 odd minutes. What we've produced is what we think is to get as close as we can to Cromwell's voice. Cromwell's voice was the key phrase used by one of our advisory panel when we first started. That's to say, where Cromwell himself contributed to what has come down to us. Essentially, it is all his writings, all the speeches which were taken down, many of them in shorthand, which was as good as Pitman's. It's just that writing with a quill isn't quite as efficient as writing with a biro, but it's Pitman's with a quill. And David will no doubt talk a bit more about that, yeah? And then thirdly, recordings of conversations he had, where we had a fairly strict protocol. There had to be reasonable grounds for thinking that the conversation was recorded at the time, that people went away and wrote down what they'd heard. And we erred on the side of generosity, but that was our basic criterion. Is there a reasonable prospect that this conversation was recorded at the time and not remembered 20 years later? We removed all the things that were where there's no evidence whatsoever that he had any input, so he just signed things. We removed most of the pro formas, except for exemplar. We have exemplar of the various kinds of document, the warrants and safe conduct and that kind of thing. And we produced 1,077 items. That's twice as many as Carlyle Lomas, and half as many as Abbott. But now his own voice came through loud and clear. About 200 items are not in previous editions, though it has to be said most of those are short accounts of speeches he made in these early years in Parliament in 1640 to 1648, which are available in print elsewhere, but now gathered for the first time into his edition. We found, I think, 43 entirely new items that haven't appeared before, but none of them, I have to say, are of great significance. We have, however, tripled the number of holographs and autographs. That's to say, we have found a very large number of the originals that in previous editions have only been included from varying degrees of 17th, 18th, and 19th century copies. So we've now got a much more authoritative versions. We've stabilized texts by doing historical scholarship on which of various versions of letters, for example, from Ireland, we were able to work out which printer at that time had the government contract and therefore had the official version. The others are then, as it were, deteriorated versions of the official printing. We have edited them from what we take to be the best text, and then we have annotated all the major variants in the footnotes, so you can actually see what other versions say. And in a few cases where there are such major discrepancies, we have published more than one version side by side. And in one case, we produced 3 versions because they are all very different, but we think they were worth doing. And we produced them with a very clear layout. This is what it should have been published 10 days ago. It's now going to be published, we think, on the 2nd of November. So here, for your edification, is what it's going to look like. There is a unique number for each document, which you can see is in the form of year, month, day. This means you can, since that you do it like that, you can then easily negotiate, and when it becomes an online version, you will be able to look for each document because that is the identifier. There's a title, then there's the date written out, and sometimes the date will be more various than we have to have one date, which is our best guess of the date. If there's a variety of dates, that's given the date field, then the source, then the introduction, and then the text itself. We think half the words of the edition are in the introduction. The introductions are both stabilizing the text, explaining what the status of the text we're printing is, and it also is contextualizing the content of the thing. And to give you the death warrant, obviously, which Cromwell did sign and did have a say in the composition of, and he appears, we turn it round, that's what the death warrant looks like, and you may or may not be able to see that he is the 3rd name down. And the reproduction, you can see the double L of his name. I'll move on rapidly from that rather disastrous illustration. This is what a complete document looks like This is a very, very short document, but you can see there the same thing, but with the document, slightly larger typeface for the actual content of the document. That is the complete document. So I am going, I think now, to hand over to David just to take us very briefly on to the next little section of his own.
Great. Well, as John said, we'd hope to be able to show you an actual volume, or the 3 volumes, but I'm afraid, alas, they're not published yet. But this is the cover of the volume which I've been involved with, volume 3, just to show you what it will look like. And all being well, this will be published early in November. Well, as John mentioned, we've succeeded in tripling the number of autograph or holograph sources. Wherever possible, we've tried to go back to the manuscript original, either of the whole of a document, the holograph, or at least where it's got Cromwell's signature in an autograph. And that in itself generates some interesting historical information, because it enables us, for example, to see how Cromwell's signature changed over the course of his career. It reflects the different ways in which he signed himself, but also, in some ways, his deteriorating health. And I'm now going to show you how the signature alters. If we look, this is quite dramatic, really, because the signature that you see there in 1651 is very much how his signature looked through a lot of the earlier part of his adult life. And he would have just turned 50, born in 1599. So you've just turned 50 when that upper signature was signed. If we look to the next one, 1657, the year before he died, you see a much more shaky signature, but also a different way of signing himself. That by that stage, he'd been Lord Protector from 1653 onwards, and he's signing off Oliver P, exactly like a week ago we saw the new king sign off Charles R for the first time. Here you see Cromwell's signature as Oliver P, but what a shaky signature. It's thought that he had malaria, which recurred at various times during his adult life. You see there a very much more shaky signature. And that has enormous historical significance, because by 1657, Cromwell is wondering about the future. There's the whole debate that year, will he or won't he accept Parliament's offer to become king? And when you see evidence like that, it gives us a whole new dimension on the nature of Cromwell's life and the dynamics of the politics of those later years. And that leads me to hand back to John.
Just speak for 1 minute, and then David have his major go after that. Unfortunately, for complicated reasons, I wasn't able to produce the original of this, but one of the major things we've done is to examine the authenticity of Cromwell documents. There's a very, very major letter that he's written in early 1648, which historians have relied on intensively, in which he appears to predict the purge of Parliament and setting up the trial of the king. We've established, which nobody had noticed before, there are 3 versions of this letter. None of them are the original. One of them ascribes it to Cromwell, and one ascribes it to his scoutmaster. And we are unable in the end to determine whether it is a genuine Cromwell letter or it is a letter written by somebody else. I've written about a 15-page explanation of the options and leave it with the author, the readers, to make up their own mind. He also has, it's where he predicts the readmission of the Jews as well. So it's a really important letter, which was found in the late 19th century and just carelessly attributed to Cromwell. And I personally think it's not by Cromwell. I have to say my colleagues who are editing volume 1 think it is by Cromwell. So it's a really borderline case. But here's the one. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the original out, but this is a letter in which we now think, that this letter, which sows a lot of dissension amongst the parliamentarians in June 1643, in which it sets Cromwell actually, or appears to set Cromwell against Sir Thomas Fairfax, and to cause lots of bad feeling. There are the list of signatories, the parliamentary leader in Derbyshire, John Gell, Oliver Cromwell, Sir Miles Hobart, Thomas Gray, and Sir John Hotham. We're now convinced that's a forgery forged by Hotham in order to create dissension because he's a traitor. Now, in a recent biography by my good friend Ronald Hutton, he makes a great deal of Cromwell's vindictive behavior towards Hotham in hounding him to be executed as a traitor. If I had my signature forged in order to create dissension with a senior colleague, I'd be pretty hacked off. And I would want to see him removed from his command, and I would want to see him tried with treason. We found original signatures by Gell, Hobart, and Gray, which are clearly nothing like these signatures. They look suspiciously like Hotham's handwriting. We found a letter by Hotham in which he spells Hobart that way, which nobody else ever does. So we're convinced it's a forgery by Hotham, and a month later he's arrested, and 6 months later he's executed for treason. It matters a lot that this episode, which seems to show one kind of dissension within the parliamentarian movement, turns out to be something very different. But that kind of persistent work in tracking down the individual signatures of individual signatories, from having recovered the original, which hasn't been seen in previous editions, is the kind of thing that we're aiming is making a big difference with our edition. So is that right, David? You take over at this point?
Yes. So one of the problems that we particularly had to address in volume 3 was the question of Cromwell's speeches. And the speeches actually pose a particular difficulty for historians, especially in terms of trying to reconstruct Cromwell's voice. Because as John mentioned, the idea of getting as close to Cromwell's voice as we can has been really the mantra of the whole project. But when you come to look at the records that survive of the various speeches that he made, particularly in this era from 1653 to 58, when he was Lord Protector, there are particularly intractable problems because different kinds of evidence have survived down to the present. There's a certain amount of evidence which suggests that Cromwell spoke either extempore or from minimal notes. Sometimes there are signs that he had an agenda in his speeches of what he wanted to cover. And then particularly as his health deteriorated and time went on, he would ramble or he would lose his way. In one speech, he talks about 4 fundamentals. He goes through 3 of them, and the third one then takes him off onto a long disquisition. And then he has to say, well, no, as you were, wind back. You know, there was a 4th one there that I was then going to say. And that tendency becomes more marked as we go closer and closer to his death. I'll give you 1 or 2 examples of that a bit later on. But what we hardly ever have are any kind of notes that he worked from. Instead, we've got 2 different kinds of evidence. One is are things written up by contemporaries who actually heard him give a speech, which they then wrote up. People who actually heard the words that he was uttering, which they then write up. Or alternatively, we have a kind of authorized version, sometimes published a week or more, several weeks in a few cases, after the speech was actually delivered, but which Cromwell had himself worked over and then given his authorization to, his sort of imprimatur. So you've either got some version that's taken down by an actual listener of what he actually said on that occasion, or you've got an authorized version that he then publishes a bit later on. And there is a real question for historians as to which is the more authentic record of his voice and of the words that he actually uttered. And ultimately, that is insoluble. Is it what somebody heard him say at the time, or is it what he authorizes later on? Well, sometimes that can give you such discrepant versions that, as John mentioned, we've had to publish more than one text, sometimes an A and a B text. And a bit later, I'll give you an example of just how discrepant those can be. But otherwise, what we've tried to do is to indicate in footnotes and through textual annotation exactly where the crucial points of variance are. And sometimes those can vary simply by one word being different. In other times, it's a much more radical variation. But I think it would be fair to say that what we've tried to do is not necessarily resolve those textual discrepancies, some of which are essentially insoluble. And what we've absolutely not done is approach this in the way that the Abbott edition was, which was really where Abbott would create hybrid texts of the speeches, usually governed by what seemed like the most eye-catching or the most striking form of words. And he wouldn't indicate that they were pulled from different sources, and they were sort of merged together into a single text. So what we've tried to do is give readers of this new edition the fullest possible information about what phrase comes from where, so that the reader can then decide for themselves what they make from that. And hand over to John for the next bit, but in a moment I'll come back and give you some specific examples of these sort of discrepancies.
Sometimes everything hangs on how big a space is within a word. One of the most fascinating, one of the most famous things that Cromwell said, and has been much discussed, is this: I had rather a plain so this is what our edition looks like when it's a holograph. We've left it with the line endings exactly as they are. You can see the corrections, you can see where he's crossed things out, and so on. And you can also see, as you'll see in a moment, I'll show you the original, and you'll see how the length of the lines itself is very suggestive. But he says this: I'd rather a plain rusty-coated captain that knows what he fights for and love what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman is nothing else. I honour a gentleman that is so indeed. Plain rusty-coated captain means, of course, yeoman. I'd rather have a yeoman farmer who is a godly than a gentleman who is only a gentleman. The interesting question is, what is the force in that sentence of the word indeed? If you say, so does he mean, as the footnote says, the word indeed is strictly redundant? It doesn't mean anything. But if Cromwell wrote or intended two words, indeed, it changes the meaning very significantly. It would radicalize what he meant. He'd be saying that he could only honor a gentleman who was indeed like a plain rusty-coated captain. So it radicalizes it. So I only value a gentleman who is actually godly. I don't do it in himself. So what did he actually write? So we found the original. There is the original. I love showing this one because it's a very classic example of the fact of a personality trait, which he cannot bear to leave an inch of any piece of paper unfilled. And he writes down and he writes in the margins. And you can see, actually, if I turn it round, the writing gets smaller and smaller until now you can work out, there's lots of things you can work out from that. And that is characteristic. Now, the word indeed comes just at the transition from the main text into the thing. Now, what did he say? Did he say indeed, or did he say indeed? Make up your own minds. Make up your own minds. So, of course, what we've done as throughout the edition is not to make a decision, but to tell readers that they've got a problem they've got to resolve. I have no doubt that's two words. The whole of that letter there isn't a single example of an N that is not looped to the next letter, the bottom of the N up. So I think it's pretty clear. Again, I have to say, not all my colleagues, and I gave a presentation on these sorts of things in Oxford to a lot of quite bright people in Oxford last autumn, and I asked them for a vote. It was exactly 50-50. So I won't have a vote now, but you might. So does that give you an idea of the kind of fascination of our project and why it really matters? Even something as tiny as that can really matter. Now, the next one I'll just give you is the Putney debate. The Putney debates in October, November 1647 is when the army, the general council of the army, that's the officers and representatives of the rank and file, the agitators, although actually it's adjutators, assistants, not agitators meaning militants, but that's another issue. They did meet, and amongst the things they discuss are the future of the monarchy. Does God want them to execute Charles I? And the decision is not yet, or at least it's not yet clear. But also, what should the franchise be? And of course, there's a famous debate about this. The famous statement of one of the of Colonel Rainsborough, that the poorest he that in England has as much a right as the richest he. It is gendered. The edition of the Putney debates which exists doesn't tell you, because it's interested in the rhetoric, that they reached an agreement. And what we've found on this slide is the agreement. If you at the 5, that there'll be a redistribution of seats to more fully reflect the whole body of those to elect. The electorate was to be decided by Parliament before it was dissolved on the 1st of September 1648, must include all freeborn Englishmen who have served the Parliament in the late war for the liberties of the kingdom or were in service before the 14th of June 1645. Naseby. After Naseby, after the greatest battle of the Civil War, something like 2,000 former royalists changed sides and were enrolled, and they weren't to be enfranchised. So but what they're saying, so the agreement is the poorest he is in the army shall get the vote, not the poorest youth in England. The point is that the levellers, the rank and file, the officers and Cromwell all agreed on the franchise. It is not the great moment, as a lot of historians have said, in which Cromwell is defended as a conservative, and he is defeating the radicals, the levellers. They can still agree. The important issue they debated at Putney was not, in fact, the franchise. It was what God wanted to do about the monarchy. So again, we think that relatively small things can have major transformative effects.
So to give you a couple of examples from the speeches of how this can work, in the spring of 1657, Cromwell is agonizing over whether or not to accept the title of king. All the civilian politicians of any note, and particularly those of a legal persuasion, are very keen that he should become king. Virtually all his army colleagues are adamant that he should not. And we can see through a series of speeches, particularly in April and early May of 1657, Cromwell agonizing over this. And there's one particular speech on the 13th of May where he wonders what God's providence is pointing him towards. And in this particular passage, you can see, we go to that third line, this has often been reproduced as saying, truly the providence of God hath laid aside this title providentially de facto. But there is one very important contemporary version of this speech, which has instead the word, truly the prudence of God hath laid aside this title providentially de facto, which in a way may be more plausible, because then you wouldn't be repeating the word providence or providentially. Equally, you can see how in the handwriting, perhaps an abbreviated version of providence might have been mistranscribed as prudence, but it's actually making a quite different point about the workings of God to say prudence rather than providentially. And equally, this is a speech, that speech on the 13th of April, where we've actually had to produce two versions, two parallel versions. And here is version A of another passage just a little bit later, which again has been very often quoted. I will not seek to set up that which providence hath destroyed and laid in the dust, and I would not build Jericho again. And this is somewhat to me and to my judgment and conscience, that it is true. It is that hath an awe upon my spirit, and I must confess, as the times are, they are very fickle, very uncertain. There's another version that is probably closer to somebody's notes at the time, what we called version B, where it simply appears as the underlined passage there, we should not set up that which providence hath destroyed. This hath an awe upon my spirit, and I must confess times are very fickle and unsettled. Well, it's much shorter, it's much more abbreviated than the other version. Is that because the note taker simply couldn't keep notes fast enough, and as a result, it's just the highlights of the longer passage that we saw? Or is it because the other record contains a more fully worked out version that Cromwell then authorized? In these cases, we felt that the best thing to do was actually to publish both versions, and then readers can judge for themselves. But this sort of variation affects some of the most quoted of Cromwell's speeches. There's another speech that he makes in January 1658 on one of the last occasions when he addresses Parliament. And it concerns particularly this section that begins, it is not that only, but we have an appetite to variety, to be not only making wounds, but as if we should see one making wounds in a man's sides, and would desire nothing more than to be groping, groveling with his fingers in those wounds. You can see that as we've annotated there, even a passage that has been so often quoted as that presents all sorts of textual complications, which we've noted in the footnotes, so that you can see that, you know, some passages, some versions talk about groping and groveling. Some use graveling rather than groveling. There are lots of little variations like that. I have to say that the main conclusion I've formed, looking at Cromwell's speeches, is that he's a lot more sensitive to audience than he's sometimes being given credit to. In terms of pitch and in terms of tone, he's very, very sensitive to audience. People have sometimes taken the speeches as being, as it were, objective statements of his inner beliefs. And I think there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of awareness of audience in there. So he is, I suppose I think of him, as it were, as a bit more Tony Blair and a bit less Tony Benn than I thought when I started this project.
I may just reverse that verdict, actually. The clapping next door suggests we're running out of time, so I'll be brief. Two things where we think we have made major discoveries. This document, a declaration of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland for the undeceiving of deluded and seduced people, has only ever existed in a London printing from March 1650. And is an attempt by Cromwell, as it is usually seen, which reveals his deep contempt for Catholics and for the Irish. But we have discovered that the only known copy is owned by the racing correspondent of the Irish Times, of an earlier version published in Cork. Certain acts and declarations made by the ecclesiastical congregation of the archbishops, bishops, and other prelates met at Clonmacnoise. together with the Declaration of the Lord Lieutenant. So basically what we find is that everything he wrote was a response to claims by the Irish clergy that he was coming to extirpate the Catholic population and to extirpate Catholicism in Ireland. The English version is significantly different and is changed for an English audience. The Irish version is violently anti-clerical. Yours is a covenant with death and hell. But then Cromwell is profoundly anti-clerical. He tells the Scottish Presbyterians, yours may be a covenant with death and hell. He hates clergy who intrude themselves between the raw authority of Scripture and the individual conscience. It's violently anti-clerical, but it is not anti-Catholic, and it's certainly not anti-Irish. It's anti-royalist, in fact. And seeing it in its proper context and its proper text is transformative, in my judgment, about Cromwell's time in Ireland. And I've spent a lot of time in the last few years saying the English did terrible things in Ireland in the 1650s. Cromwell constantly tried to moderate those terrible things. And much of my mission when I was Professor of British and Irish History before I retired was the great words of G.K. Chesterton. The tragedy of the English conquest of Ireland in the 17th century is that the Irish cannot forget it and the English cannot remember it. And the Irish must remember it better and the English must remember it at all. And then finally, just for 2 minutes, one of the most famous episodes in Cromwell's career is the transformation at the height of the Civil War, the sacking of all the aristocratic generals and the creation of the new model army, in which he uniquely becomes the only member of Parliament who retains a command, because a self-denying ordinance removed all working politicians from military command. He somehow survives it. He makes a major assault on the Earl of Manchester, his superior officer, on the 25th of November, 1644, which has been endlessly quoted and was reproduced in the 19th century. The thing is, he didn't write it. Here, I've got to really abbreviate here. Here is what people said who attended that speech. He did confess his judgment was for independency, and that so were most of them under his command. And it might be some Anabaptists, but he told them 'twas not for that he chose them, but because they are honest and gallant men that are faithful to their duty. Not a word on religion appears in the version which is in the state papers and which was printed in the 19th century. Detective work has established that Cromwell was at the time staying with a journalist called John Dillingham, who published a periodical called Parliament Scout. The version is in his hand with Cromwell's emendations, and it completely secularizes the document. And there are two versions of it, one of which Cromwell says, and I said to the Earl of Manchester, and the second version says, and some said to the Earl of Manchester, or it was said to. In other words, completely removing him from it. In brief, Cromwell had a headlong row with his commanding officer. There was no way the House of Lords were going to give up the Earl of Manchester. There was every chance the House of Commons would give up Cromwell, his position as a radical on the left. So his friends sanitized what he actually said in order to produce something that would protect him. Manchester went crazy trying to get hold of this document, which only went to a committee of the House of Commons, and a second version, further sanitized version produced in case the Commons voted that the document be handed over, in which case what will be handed over was one in which Cromwell never appears. So we've got here something which is very important, not only in that the content is very different, but it really, really begins to take us to the heart of that side of Cromwell, which isn't insouciant, which is capable of understanding, and we can think of our modern politicians, of what he wished he'd said, what he'd like it to be thought he'd said, what other people could say that he said. Now, is he doing it himself, or does he have minders who are doing it for him? That's for the reader now to decide. But that is, I think, our final illustration of why we think, not only, as I hope we've conveyed, the huge fun it's been to do this massive project, but also that it will make a difference. And we have not solved the problems, but we've clarified the issues that all succeeding historians will have to decide on. Thank you. And we've left you with 15 minutes for questions, and I'm going to put up another picture of Cromwell in a minute. But while you're gathering your thoughts about questions, are we getting any questions coming in? Not online yet. So if anyone just put their hands up and ask either or both of us.
At the back.
Okay.
Have to wait and go quiet.
I've got my picture to put up.
Sorry. I noticed in one of the transcriptions that there was the word loose, L-O-O-S-E, and I'm not sure how far you thought about spellings, because loose, as I know to my cost, is a very common spelling error. Yeah. They actually mean lose.
Yeah.
And so I wondered where spellings could matter in terms of the interpretation.
Absolutely. We have always transcribed what is written. Where we think there is an ambiguity in that, we put in a footnote to sort of clarify what the options are. We've not ever imposed meaning. We don't want to impose meaning. We want to allow the reader to decide, but we've given guidance to readers, because we're hoping this edition will become used in schools in A-level and so on, particularly once it becomes an online version. Oxford University Press commissioned it to be both in 3 printed volumes, and also to on one of their platforms, which is called Oxford Scholarly Editions Online, which is very, very widely used in schools, and we're hoping therefore it will be used. So we've done quite a lot of clarification where there are deep ambiguities in a word that doesn't mean, well, I mean, a good example, the word prevent, which in the 17th century meant go before. And so those was on the front row for Selwyn may or may not know, and when you were inducted into anything in Selwyn, we used to say, "Prevent us, O Lord, in all our doings." And it means go before us, O Lord, in all our doings. I know prevent, and I noticed that one very early on and thought, oh, we better gloss that. So we have glossed back words. Yes, thank you.
A couple of things. I was wondering what your convention is in terms of the dating. You mentioned that each document has a date that identifies it.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your convention is in terms of the first 3 months of the year.
Yeah, we have made it clear by the head date and so on. We've modernized it, but it is a complicated thing. In the course of the 20th century, a team based in Yale set out to catalogue everything printed before the year 1700. And then another company came along and they microfilmed everything. And another company went along and digitized the images. So it's a history of 20th century technology. Now, because of their assumption that between the 1st of January and 25th of March, you had the New Year's Day was 25th of March, that if it was between the 1st of January and 25th of March, you obviously have to change the date. That document I read, I gave you about the Declaration of the Order of Tenant Ireland for the undeceiving of the seduced and deluded people, is dated January 1650. So they assume it's by his successor in Ireland, Henry Ireton, which isn't, because when he was in Ireland dealing with the Irish, Cromwell used Catholic dating, continental dating, not English Julian calendar. So Cromwell always, it was easier when we're dealing with the Irish to use Irish dates. And of course, the Irish were also 11 days behind. So it was only in 1753 that the English joined the rest of the world in bringing the calendar up to date. And guess what? The equivalent of the Daily Mail said the government is robbing you of 11 days of your life.
And I also just wanted to ask about, you mentioned that you tracked down so many original versions of documents. I wondered how many were in Cromwell's own hand,
Right.
and did he use secretaries to draft
Yes,
things?
you distinguish between holograph is when he actually writes it in his own hand, which is family correspondence, very confidential letters to colleagues. And then from 1643 onwards, he always has clerks whose hands, of course, we come now to know. We don't know their names, but we can tell which clerk it is. And those are autographs. So autographs are where he signed it. But very frequently, when you get the originals, they have his very, very clear emendations. Fortunately, one of the team has a kind of almost miraculous ability to identify hands and remember hands. And so he quite often can say, oh, this was written by Cromwell, but amended by so-and-so. So yes, we've done a lot of work on handwriting. What I say by recovering the originals, I mean autographs and holographs. Because previously a lot of documents were, because of his fame at the time, a lot of them were copied in the early years and then went missing, only to reappear in modern times.
You referred to an earlier or a previous edition, previous author, and I inferred a criticism from the fact that he'd got to dislike Cromwell. Do you think it's important to like your subject?
David, you go first on that one.
Yeah. Well, I think it's W.C. Abbott. It's this Harvard historian whose 4-volume edition of Cromwell's writings and speeches came out between 1937 and 47. And this is the chap who really falls out of love with his subject. And it's often been cited as an example, one of the few examples of, as it were, a biographer who loses sympathy with their subject. Biographers are much more often criticized for getting too close to their subject and too sympathetic to their subject. But Abbott on Cromwell is slightly like Hugh Trevor Roper on Archbishop Laud. It's an example of somebody who came to really dislike their subject, and the historical context that Abbott was working with the rise of the Third Reich and then the Second World War, seems to have really preyed on his mind. So the introductions to the 4 volumes get ever more hostile, and the parallels with Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin get ever stronger. I think probably the ideal is to remain as scholarly and detached and objective as possible. That's the ideal. But to end up with a strong prejudice against one's subject is certainly rarer. The Abbott problem is rarer than the reverse of it. But the ideal is to stay detached, I think.
I've always thought I'm in the perfect position to be the biography of Cromwell. In fact, I'm writing a big biography. I've written a short biography of Cromwell, which originally came out in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, was then published as small, separate. But I'm now writing a big biography for general readers. I think I'm in an ideal position because I'm a Catholic clergyman. And as a Catholic clergyman, I don't like his theology at all. But as a Catholic clergyman, I do like people of faith. And I sort of feel that because I don't share his theological obsessions, I am more detached and more, I don't actually have to believe the Holy Spirit is informing him, which I might if he was a Catholic fanatic. And it also, it certainly seems to me an English Catholic is an ideal person to write about Cromwell in Ireland, because my Catholicism makes me sort of worried for the Irish, and my Englishness makes me feel they had massacred the Catholics had massacred 12,000 Protestants a decade earlier, and he's sorting that out.
And although I can't emulate that, I think, one of the few people who is a life member both of the Cromwell Association and the Charles I King and Martyr Society.
We have time for one last question. And had his hand up first.
Showed us the document, and as you said, P instead of R for Rex. The signature seems to me to be LP in one letter.
Yeah, the architecture. Should be. It's fine if you go to the but it's a friend LP or he's got it's important because, of course, if he was to become king, now, like was he? And of course, it was Rex, Oliver, he, but we would actually be still discussing it from that kind of record. I think that's an important, it's an important thing. It's to Oliver Cromwell, and because he was question.
Well, it was related to that. It was in fact related to that signature. He would have become king.
Charles I would also monarchy, and the only God could restore it was the Son of God. Changed his mind about that. He wants to have limited power. He doesn't power cost to the peace of the parish. It's so interesting because on his head, sort of it was an almost a real face. The cost of the program, not actually, it's Ireland. But the government was heading towards bankruptcy, and there was not easy way beginning to grow. He got sort of acceptance, broad acceptance, but not broad support. Although he had to him is very small. Actually, welcomed him was still too narrow a base. It would take time for that to develop. I'm not sure he would have lived to 70 that he would have been able to do that without other things getting complicated. He always went to fighting on the continent. In the Continental situation in across the West Indies and America. It's more difficult for him until here. I don't think he was going to find the end of that, a call from God to become king. Which is the history so thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend. Yes, absolutely.
Just thank you very much. It was great.
I don't think it's